This is the Montana Ministry Network podcast. This episode features guest speaker Karl Vaters at the 2026 Network Council. Let's get started.
Well, tonight, I have really been looking forward to our time with Pastor Karl Vaters. Karl has been given really an anointing by the Lord to help produce materials to encourage our smaller churches, to help them not only thrive, but capitalize on the unique opportunities that God will give you in a smaller community. He has written 5 books that deal with this subject. He does a bi-weekly podcast that goes much deeper into all of the teachings that come out of this. And also, he helps large churches and small churches learn how to work together so we can advance the kingdom of God. You know, the Assemblies of God, I think the average church I think it's 80% now, is under 75 people. And so that represents by far the majority of our networks around the nation. And I'm so thankful that God is raising up people to encourage, to strengthen, to say you're where you're at, not because you're less than anybody else, but you're where you're at because that's where God has placed you. And people will come into the kingdom of God solely because you are there being obedient to God. So we're going to be blessed tonight. Karl's going to lead us in a general session in the morning and then again with us tomorrow night. So I trust you'll come back and be a part of this. And we're just going to let God do some great things in our hearts and lives. Would you give a warm welcome to our guest, Brother Karl, as he comes and shares? Would you like a table? Oh, there's got one right behind you. I'm good. Oh, you're good. Okay.
I was going to double-fisted mic there, it looked like. Good evening, everyone. It really is an honor to be with you. Thank you, Pastor Dave, for the invitation. Nice to meet Joe Epley actually in person after being with him on the podcast a while ago. And we've got a lot of ground to cover tonight, and you're really not here for me. You're here for the ordainees. So I'm going to say a few things that I wish someone had said to me at my ordination service. And we're going to talk tonight about redefining success in ministry. So let me begin with this quick introduction. I always introduce myself this way. Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and I'm a small church pastor. And the reason I introduce myself that way is I didn't know I was a small church pastor for the first 25 years of ministry out of the 40 that I've been in ministry. How could I go for 25 years as a small church pastor and not know it? Well, you see, I thought I was a big church pastor that just hadn't gotten there yet. But any minute now, all this church growth stuff is going to kick in and all the numbers are going to show up. And when you wait for 25 years, you have to start redefining success in ministry. Well, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what that means, I've pastored 3 different churches in my ministry life. The first church that we pastored was a tiny little chapel in the redwood forest on the coast of California. It was so deep into the forest that if you drove into the church parking lot at noon on a sunny California day, your automatic headlights went on. It was rural. Then we pastored another church for the 20 longest months of our ministry in the northern part of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I left there not sure if I was really called to ministry anymore. And then the Lord called us to go to Orange County, California. Yes, that means that all my adult life and all of my ministry life has been spent in California. You have to love me anyway. Jesus says so. And we showed up to this tiny little church in Orange County, and I was beaten up from the previous church. And I showed up to a little church that had been through 5 pastors in the previous 10 years. So they'd been beaten up pretty badly too. In fact, they had had serious conversations about holding a vote to just close the church. But they thought, let's bring in one more pastor and see if the Lord has something for us. So a wounded pastor came to a wounded church. I do not recommend that combination. But the Lord was in that for us and for them, and he helped them heal us, and he helped us to heal them. It's a small church still today. In fact, this room really reminds me of it because we have the wide and the shallow. Our room is about 2/3 as shallow as this, and it's about half as wide. So it's a small room on Sunday. But as I say, they've been through 5 pastors in the previous 10 years. There were about 20 very discouraged people there when we showed up. And for the first 7 years or so, about all we did was have worship services and meals together. That wasn't on purpose. That's just all we had the bandwidth for. Let's just worship and eat together and see if the Lord will bring some healing in the middle of that. And I remember after being there for 7 years, I got in the car after a Thursday in the office, and I was about to start the car, and I was looking at the church through the windshield of the car, and all of a sudden it hit me. Oh, I'm looking at a healthy church. This is a healthy church. And then because I was in the car, I had this image hit me. I thought, I feel like I've been under the hood of this car of this church for 7 years. I finally got the engine running well. Now I'm in the driver's seat, and I don't know where to take it. How do you pastor a healthy church? I hadn't pastored one in a decade, and they hadn't been one in 2 decades. So I went to the deacon board, and I said, I think we're healthy. And they were more surprised than I was. They said, yeah, what do we do now? At that point, we were running about 75 people. But really, it wasn't about the size. It was about the health. And they said, well, now that we're healthy, let's share this with others. Let's start doing some outreach. So we did some evangelism and some advertising and some outreach. And over the next 7 or 8 years, we got to about 200 people, which more than overwhelmed our tiny facility twice on a Sunday. That was when all the church growth conferences started calling me and going, Karl, we want you to come and tell us how you took a church from 20 to 200 in just 15 years. Your laughter is appropriate. Yeah, you don't get those calls. Not big enough, not fast enough. But we were overwhelming our tiny facility, and so I thought we got to get a bigger place. And we looked around, and we found a local junior high school, and on Sundays they allowed us to rent their Kappa Gymnatora librarium. All the junior high schools in Montana have one of those big, those rooms too, yeah. And it was twice the size of this room, so for us it was massive. And faithfully, every Sunday, we tore all the stuff down from our sanctuary, brought it over there, set it up, had church there, and brought it back again for the rest of the week. And in the next 2 years, our church grew from 200 people to over 400 people on a Sunday. And that was when I thought, oh, finally, I'm not a small church pastor anymore. Things are good. And then it held steady for a little while. And then faster than it went up, it started to go down. In 2 years, we had gone from 200 to 400 people. And then in less than a year, we went from 400 down to, actually, I don't know exactly how small we got because it's fun to count when you're growing. But when it's collapsing, don't give me the numbers. I don't want to know. In fact, that was one of the big things of the church growth movement at the time was if it counts, count it. And what I've discovered is for a lot of small church pastors, it counts too much to count. It matters too much to count. It's too painful to count. And that's where I was. It was just too painful to count. And I can tell you this, every Sunday was under 100. Some Sundays were under 50. And there had been no scandal and there had been no split. And I was left reeling. So I left the church for 40 days. The only reason I left for 40 days was I couldn't find an 80 in the Bible. It's sad but true, but I actually did a Bible software search for somebody in the Bible had to have taken 100 or 80 or 100-day retreat that I just didn't notice. So I thought if it's in the Bible, they'll let me do it, right? But it's all 40s. So, but I took 40 days away, and I did not know if I would go back. And during that 40 days, I spent 2 of those days, 2 hours on 2 of those days each week, sitting in a pastoral counselor's office. And I sat with him and just kind of poured my heart out. What's going on? What's happening to me? Why am I a failure in ministry? And that was when he said to me, Karl, it sounds to me like you need to figure out how to redefine success in ministry. Quite frankly, I wanted to punch him in the nose. I said, so you're telling me I've been trying to jump 10 feet, but I can only jump 8 feet. So let's lower the bar to 8 feet, jump over that, and call it success. That's not success, that's cheating. He said, Karl, that's not what I'm talking about. He says, if the bar is over here, there's something over here that God has for you that has nothing to do with numbers. And then he said a sentence that changed my life. He said, Karl, you have to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. And I said, I don't know what that means. And he answered me honestly. He said, yeah, I don't either. But if we don't figure this out together, it sounds like it's going to kill a great church and take a good pastor out of pastoral ministry. And there's no reason for either of those things to happen. So since then, I've been on a relentless search to redefine success in ministry without numbers attached to it. What does that look like? Just to kind of bring you up to speed on things. For the talk that I'm doing tonight and for tomorrow, I've created a page on my website. So if you scan that QR code, you can go and you can get all the notes for tonight, for both sessions tomorrow, including clickable links to other articles that I've written if you want more information. So you can go to karlvaters.com/MMN26. And if you don't know what those last letters and numbers mean, you may be in the wrong room. But that's where you can get all of the notes for everything I'll be talking about while I'm with you this week. So let's take a look at redefining success in ministry. And let's actually, first thing we've got to do is, I've been talking about small churches, so let's define it, because small is a relative term. You have a definition of small church in your mind. I have a different definition of small church in my mind, and we're both right. But I'm going to tell you mine because I have the microphone, so that you can understand where I'm coming from as I talk about small church. Because small church in Orange County is different than small church in Montana, right? So here's how I look at it. There are two very distinct types of small churches. There's a church of 50, give or take 50. And there's a church of 150, give or take 50. Those are two very different types of small churches, but I consider them both small. And I know you just heard those numbers and you went, 150, give or take. So this guy thinks 200 is a small church. That may be bigger than the biggest church in your town. I get it. I do. But here's why they're both considered small. In a church of 50, give or take, the lead pastor knows everybody and is at all of the events. So there's a constant pastoral presence. In a church of 150, give or take, the pastor knows all of the regulars and is at all of the main events. So there's still a constant pastoral presence. But once you get above 200 or so, it's the biggest shift in the way we lead churches, and here's why. God knows everyone and is everywhere, and you're not him. We have limitations, and 200 is about the limit. And a church of 200 is about the limit to the size of a church where the pastor can be a constant pastoral presence. So here's the biggest difference that we'll start out with tonight in the differences between big and small churches. Small church leadership relies on the pastor's presence. So when we talk to small church pastors and small church leaders, which is the majority of churches in the world and in the country and certainly in this room, we're talking about how to lead with pastoral presence. You're in the room all the time. But big church leadership compensates for the pastor's absence. So as a church gets bigger, especially into the hundreds and certainly into the thousands, there are far more events that happen without the pastor in the room, and there are far more people that the pastor doesn't know than that the pastor does know. That's not a bad thing. That's simply the nature of size. But here's part of the reason why I emphasize that I'm a small church pastor, is because most of the time, the person standing in this position in front of other pastors like this is usually pastoring one of the biggest churches in the room. There's nothing wrong with that. I have learned and continue to learn from my big church friends. But when they teach other pastors, they typically teach how to pastor by compensating for your absence rather than by pastoring with presence. Because that's what they're doing, and so they teach you what they do well. And that doesn't correspond to, as we just heard, about 90% of the churches in the world and in the country. So we're going to talk about leadership by presence. Now, here I am in this pastoral counselor's office, not sure if I'm going to go back to the church and stay in ministry or not. How did I end up there? Well, I ended up there because of something that I have since come to call the grasshopper myth. The title of my first book is The Grasshopper Myth. And when you write a book entitled The Grasshopper Myth, like Ricky used to say to Lucy, you got some splaining to do. What is the grasshopper myth? Well, here's how I define it in the book. The grasshopper myth is the false impression that our small church ministry is less than what God says it is because we compare ourselves with others. What's the problem word in that sentence? Compare. We all know it, don't we? Yeah. Comparison is the death of healthy ministry. Because if you're judging the success of your ministry by comparing it to the size of others, you will either be bigger than them and filled with pride or smaller than them and filled with shame, and neither pride nor shame is the basis for healthy ministry. You cannot pastor well from either of those bases. So that's what it's defined as, but why do I call it the grasshopper myth? Where does that title come from? Well, it comes from the book of Numbers, chapter 13. 12 spies go into the promised land. 10 of them come back with a negative report. And a part of that report includes these words: all the people we saw there are of great size. One translation said there are giants in the land. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. So look at that verse. Where did they seem like grasshoppers first? In their own eyes. I've got good news for you. If you don't see a grasshopper in your mirror, no one else will see a grasshopper in you. It starts with self-despising, always, always. And this is good news. See, here I am. I'm pastoring in Orange County, California, and I live in the land of the giant churches. Right? Saddleback Church, Church on the Way, Angelus Temple, where the Church of the Foursquare Gospel was founded. The original Calvary Chapel is less than a mile from my front door. The original Vineyard Church. Azusa Street is less than a 45-minute drive from my front door, which in Montana is like, let's go around the corner to a restaurant for lunch. So I live in a place not just where big things happen, but where big movements have begun. And it's really easy to look around and go, oh, I'm just a grasshopper here. And you see, if my feeling like a grasshopper is their fault, I'm stuck with it because I can't change them. But if my feeling like a grasshopper starts with me, it can end with me. See, it's the same thing in 1 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul uses a human body as an example of what the church is like. And in 1 Corinthians 12, he tells this story, or he gives us this metaphor. And in my mind, the metaphor always began with the hand looking at the nasty, stinky foot and going, you don't need to be a part of the body. But that's not where it starts. It starts in 1 Corinthians 12:15 with this: now, if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason cease being a part of the body. It always starts with self-despising, which means it can end with us as well. So I had to start rethinking this. And as I began to rethink this, I began to discover a few things. So here are some of the few first things that I began to discover. I now call them the 3 undeniable realities of church ministry. Reality number 1 is this: 80 to 90% of churches will never be larger than 250 people. In fact, we could probably adjust that down to 200 or maybe even 150. 80 to 90% of churches will never be larger than 250. How do I know that? Because the best predictor of future events is past events, and for 2,000 years and counting, as Jesus has been relentlessly building his church, 80 to 90% of churches have not been bigger than 250 people. And it doesn't seem to be worrying Jesus at all. Right? That's reality number 1, which leads to reality number 2. Virtually all pastors will pastor a small church for at least some time in our ministry. I wish somebody had told me this in my ordination service. Because I looked around at the big churches, and including the big church we were in for the ordination. And I thought, well, that's what church looks like. That's what I'm, and then I find myself in a small church, and I thought it was just me. Now, I might not have believed it when they said, yeah, you're probably going to pastor a small church, but at least then when it happened to me, I'd have had something to refer back to. Virtually all of us will pastor a small church for at least some time in our ministry. A lot of us will pastor small churches for most of our ministry. And a whole bunch of us are going to pastor small churches for our entire time in ministry. So here's my question. If we're all going to do it, shouldn't we learn how to do it well? But for 40 years, I've gone to conferences like this, and they haven't taught me how to do small well. They've told me not to be small anymore. Right? But 90% of churches are small. And if you take a look around the world where Christians are growing as a percentage of the population, it's almost never through the building of larger churches. It's through the multiplication of healthy smaller churches. Healthy smaller churches are the engine that drives the global growth of the church. Which leads to reality number 3. You can lead a small church well without settling for less. I don't get much pushback against this ministry by other friends in ministry, at least not to my face. I think it's because if they do that, it feels like they're beating up on the little guy, and that's not a look anybody wants to have. But whenever I do get pushback, it's always on this one. Every once in a while, I'll have one of my friends who does this, but does it from a big church standpoint, who will say something like, hey, I'm glad you're out there helping small churches, Karl, but, I don't want my church to be small because I want to keep reaching people for Jesus. To which I always respond, so do you think 90% of your peers in ministry don't want to reach people for Jesus, and that's why their church is small? And it's always a quick backup. Oh, no, I didn't mean that. Which I have to say, yeah, but that's what we keep hearing. That's how it feels when you say that. So just be careful. You don't just have a responsibility for what you say. You have at least some responsibility for how it hits. And I'm telling you how this hits. It hits hard and it hurts. We're not small because we don't care. Most of us have no idea why we're small. So don't make us feel guilty for it. Help us do it better. You see, I don't want churches to be small. I want small churches to be great. And your church can be great. It's not a matter of settling for less. This is never about settling for less. So how do we get out of that mindset that small is not settling for less? How do we rethink that? Here's how. We have to rethink small church as a strategy to use, not a problem to fix. See, for 40 years, I've heard from pastors in this position on these stages tell me that my small church was a problem to fix. And I was trying to fix problems that weren't problems. If I'd been told that small can be a strategy God wants to use, I'd have approached it completely differently and in a much more healthy way. Small can be strategic. Now, you may look at it and go, well, I don't know, Karl, my church did not become small strategically. That's okay. Even if you didn't become small strategically, you can move forward strategically. It doesn't matter how you got here. Maybe it's been a small church all along. Maybe it was a bigger church that's gotten small recently. Doesn't really matter how you got there. From this point on, you can do small strategically. So, we end up in this place, though, because we fall for something that I like to call IKEA envy. How many of you in the room have never been in an IKEA in your life? Raise your hand. Oh, you are the blessed and highly favored. The rest of us apparently still living under some remnant of the curse because we've had to go to an IKEA. I do not like IKEA very much, just not my favorite store. So here's what if you've never been to an IKEA, I'm going to describe the experience for you so you don't have to endure it for yourself at any point. So years ago, they built an IKEA near us. My wife said, hey, they got a new furniture store. We got to go get a piece of furniture. And I went, okay. I got in the car, and I had a furniture store in my mind. And we turned the curve on the highway, and I saw the biggest store on the planet. Astronauts are watching it from space. I'm telling you, it's that big. And I thought, that's okay. I still know how to behave in a big store. I've been to the mall. She's going to go in, get what she needs. I'm going to wander around for a while, find something that doesn't bore me completely to tears, and when she's done, we'll meet up and we'll leave. Oh, no. You're not allowed to wander around an IKEA. Now, if you've never been in an IKEA, you're thinking, how can they stop you from wandering around? Here's how. That is the floor plan of virtually every IKEA on the face of the planet. You see that dotted line? Does it look like it ought to have a piece of cheese at the end of it? You can't wander around. You've got to follow the path. Now, I want you to imagine that the chairman of Starbucks gets together with his top executives, and he says, I've got a plan for the next several years' growth of Starbucks. Let's go to the next slide. He says, we've gone around the world and we've measured all the IKEA stores, and they've got an average of 200,000 square feet. We've measured all of our Starbucks stores, and the average Starbucks store is only 800 square feet. We need to fix this if we're going to compete with IKEA. Does that make any sense Of course, no, of course it doesn't. They have about as different business models as you can possibly imagine in retail, right? So, IKEA's idea is a few stores, but as big as we can make them. Starbucks plan is as small stores and as many places as we can put them. In fact, we're going to put a bunch of our stores inside other stores. Right? Now, you don't have to like IKEA, you don't have to like Starbucks, but you cannot argue with this fact. They have both been exceptionally successful at what they set out to do. Right? Well, but how can Starbucks be successful? All their stores are so small. Small can't be successful, can it? Yeah, if it's strategic. Why not? But here's part of the challenge. We come to conferences like this so often, and we hear from pastors of IKEA-sized churches. And again, I'm grateful for them. That's great. But they tell us things that only fit in an IKEA context, and we try to take them home to our Starbucks-sized church, and then we think, were they wrong or am I stupid? I can't tell you how many conferences I left wondering that. Here's the good news. They're not wrong. You're not stupid. You're just in very different contexts. Take a look at the IKEA photo. What's on the floor? They literally have arrows on the floor. Before they put them in, people got lost in there for days. It's why they sell beds. But I've never gone into a Starbucks and gone, where are the arrows? I don't know where to go. I'm so confused. Somebody please put arrows on the floor. But we come to conferences like this. We hear from an IKEA-sized pastor about how to do arrows on the floor precision. And they need arrows on the floor precision because they're trying to move hundreds or thousands of people through multiple services and multiple venues on a weekend. And if they don't have arrows on the floor precision, it all falls to pieces. They're right. But their context is so different from ours, most of what they say doesn't apply in most churches. And most of us don't realize it. And here's why. The differences between big and small churches aren't just a matter of scale, but of type. Not just a matter of scale, but of type. A church of 50 is not a scaled down version of a church of 500, and a church of 500 is not a scaled up version of a church of 50. They're different types of churches altogether. They are pastored completely differently. So we've got to begin to understand that. Tomorrow, part of what I'm going to talk about is this Venn diagram where we're going to look at the IKEA Starbucks thing again. But before we get to that, and as I get to the point of coming to the last 10 minutes or so of this, I want to give you 3 big principles that tell us that some of the differences between big and small churches. Small is not a problem, a virtue, or an excuse. Let me talk about each of those very, very important 3 words. First of all, small is not a problem. Years ago when I was struggling at the church, trying to figure out why it wasn't getting bigger again, after it had collapsed and trying to climb back out of that and still trying to understand it all, I did what we all do when I'm in a place of emotional and spiritual crisis. I Googled it. Why won't my church grow? And the first article that came up was written by the pastor of one of the biggest churches and one of the fastest growing churches in the country. And it was entitled, 8 Reasons Some Churches Don't Grow. I thought, well, he's got it figured out. Here are the 8 reasons he gave. The vision is not clear. The focus is on trying to please everyone. Passionless leadership, manufacturing energy, lack of prayer, unwillingness to take risks, disobedience to scriptures, and selfish attitudes. And I read that list of why my church wasn't growing, and I thought, I must be committing at least one of those sins. But I thought I was praying enough. I don't feel like we're manufacturing energy. I didn't think I was selfish. And here's the thing. If you just heard that list and you don't recognize your church, next time you see a list like that, you're allowed to scroll past it without comment and read something else. In fact, I'm going to virtually guarantee that that list doesn't apply to you or the church you serve. You know how I know that? Because you showed up tonight. Passionless leaders don't show up. Prayerless leaders don't show up. Leaders who are unwilling to take risks don't show up. It makes me wonder who this pastor thinks he's writing to. Who does he think is Googling, please help my church grow at 2 a.m.? It's not the passionless pastor. It's not the prayerless pastor. It's a hurting pastor. When a hurting pastor comes to you for help, don't slap their hands, put tools in them. Small is not a problem. We've got to stop treating it that way. Now, do small churches have problems? Of course. So do big churches. Their size is not part of the problem. Small is not a problem. Secondly, small is not a virtue. Small churches are not better than big churches. Every once in a while, when people hear I'm a small church guy, they, oh, that's it, you go get those big churches. No. Anybody think we need one more way to divide the body of Christ? Like we don't have enough already? Yeah, let's fight about size now, too. No. Small is not a virtue. Small is not better than big. I actually heard this a couple times, you know. The only reason our church is so small, because we're the only church in our town preaching the true gospel. Okay, here's the deal. Unless your church is literally the only church in your town, that is so unlikely. All I got to tell you is let's have a talk about your pride problem, because that's a bigger issue than the size of your church, dude. It's ridiculous. You may not even have another Assembly of God church in town, but the Baptists are probably loving Jesus. Yeah, probably. Oh, I know it's strange to say that in this room, but yeah. Yeah, Wednesday morning, I'm going to be in San Diego talking to Evangelical Free. They think they love Jesus too. Yeah, there's another church in town. It's okay. That's not the reason your church is small. Small is not a virtue. Small is not better than big. And thirdly, small is not an excuse. We talked about this already. Small is not an excuse to do anything less than the best possible ministry you can do right now. I know that small churches can do great ministry because I've read the entire New Testament. More than once. And I have yet to read through the New Testament and see a command from Jesus to the church that I look at and go, oh, we should do, oh, we can't do that yet. We don't have enough people. Oh, Jesus says we should do, oh, we can't do that. We don't have a big enough budget yet. Oh, the Apostle Paul says the church should, oh, you got to have a building for that. We can't do that until we get a building. Not a single command to the New Testament church that requires you to have one more person, one more dollar, or one more square foot of building. Stop making excuses. Let's get to work. Your size is not an excuse to do anything less than passionate, excellent ministry for the sake of the gospel and for the reaching of your community. So here I am, and I'm taking this 40 days away. And when I'm not in the counselor's office, I wish I could tell you that I spent the rest of that 40 days in prayer and fasting. I wish I could tell you that, but I wasn't. I spent the rest of that 40 days in a bad way. I spent it eating too much ice cream and watching too much stupid TV. That's not a recommendation. That's closer to a confession of sin. Don't go home and do that. That's what I did. And if you're going to watch stupid TV, you're going to watch reality TV. I know because I live where they make them. In fact, I'm married to a real housewife of Orange County. Yeah. And as I was watching these TV shows during that period, the two that really caught my attention were the restaurant makeover shows. There's always a British guy coming into an American restaurant, and in 5 days he fixed it all up, right? I don't know, what is it about us as Americans, by the way, that we love hearing really nasty criticism, but if it's with a British accent, we're kind of okay with it. Like, didn't we fight an entire war so that we don't have to pay attention to people with British accents? Somehow. So there's always a British guy going into an American restaurant, and I noticed some trends that happen, and it's reality TV, so it's not real, I get it. But I noticed some trends. Every once in a while, they'd walk into a failing restaurant, and they'd go, I drove by 3 times because I couldn't see your sign. You need a new sign. Or they'd walk in and go, oh, what is that smell? We got to clean this carpet. Or they'd see a 20-page menu and walk into a 2-stove kitchen and go, oh, no. We're going to simplify this menu big time. That's a whole nother conversation for another time for our churches. We are way too cluttered. But one thing I noticed, they never walked into a failing restaurant, looked around and went, you know what this restaurant's problem is? It's not big enough. Because even phony reality TV stars have figured out something that the church should have figured out a long time ago. 3 words. Are you ready for them? Bigger fixes nothing. We've got this picture in the modern American church especially that getting bigger is going to fix all my problems. And I'm here to tell you it will not. Bigger fixes nothing. Right? Oh, I've got so many problems in my church because I don't have enough people. And if only we had more people in my church, I'd have fewer problems. Have you met people? There's never been a situation in history where more people have brought fewer problems. Different maybe, but never fewer. Bigger fixes nothing. Think about it this way. If you take a small and unhealthy church and you make it bigger, you now have a big, unhealthy church. And that's not better. That's worse. But if you take a small, unhealthy church and you make it healthier, even if it doesn't become bigger, because it doesn't always. Even if it doesn't become bigger, healthy is always better. It's a weird thing. You can lose with bigger. You can never lose with healthier. Quit chasing bigger, because bigger fixes nothing. Here's another way to look at it and embracing some better ideas about it. The church needs to embrace a principle that I learned recently called the long tail. The long tail is the principle by which all of the major electronics companies work. Google, Amazon, Facebook, they all work this way. But let's use YouTube as an example. So let's take a look at this scale. If you go from the bottom to the top, the higher you go up the scale, the more people are watching an individual video. And the further you go to the right, the more videos there are. So all the way over to the left, at the top of that peak, there is one video on YouTube that has been watched more than any other video in history. Only one. There's only one video that's been watched over 10 billion times, and it's pushing 17 billion at this point. Anybody have a guess as to the only almost 17 billion view video on YouTube? Despacito's number 2. Number 1, Baby Shark. Let me play it for you right now. No, I won't do it. And if you don't know what that is, it's because you don't have a toddler in your life right now. Because the toddlers just go, again, almost 17 billion times, almost double the second biggest one, right? But there's only one. So everybody wants the viral video, but there's only one. And then there's maybe a few dozen that have over 1 billion, and maybe a few hundred that have over 100 million. But it drops down real fast to the 200 view video, the 100 view video, the 50 view video. And you see the bottom right-hand corner, you see that little spot where it almost disappears in the bottom right-hand corner? That's your church's live stream that was watched by 2 people last Sunday. Welcome, you're among friends. It's okay. It's okay. Because you're not alone there. Look at how many 2-view videos there are. There are billions of 2-view videos. Here's what YouTube has figured out. There are as many eyeballs on the screen in the big spike as there are eyeballs on the screen in the long tail. So let's just change the wording on it because it's exactly the same in the church. There are about 2 billion Christians in the world. Half of them attend churches in the big spike. Half of them attend churches in the long tail. The 2 biggest churches in the world, no one's quite sure which is the biggest. One in Nigeria, one in India, both of them over 500,000 attendees in a weekend. But there's only 2 of them. Then it goes down to very few churches of over 100,000, a few more of over 10,000, a few hundred, a few thousand, actually over 1,000. But then it gets down to the church of 200, the 50, and 20. Do you realize that the church of 20 is a far more common representation in the body of Christ than even the church of 200 is? Fully half the Christians in the world attend churches under 200 in the long tail, and the other half of Christians in the world attend churches in the big spike over 200. So which half of the body of Christ are we going to look at and go, we don't need you? But here's part of the challenge. We hear from pastors in the big spike, but we're sitting in the long tail, and we're not paying enough attention to the churches in the long tail because we don't think it's a strategy to use. We think it's a problem that needs to be fixed. YouTube has been around barely 25 years. They figured it out. Shouldn't we have figured it out in the church long before YouTube did? We need everybody. And there are strategies, there are ways that God will use and is using the churches in the long tail. So, before I have one more principle and one more story to close with, just to give you an idea of what is coming up. Tomorrow morning, we're going to talk about big churches, small churches. What's the difference? Now that we've talked about that there are differences, we're going to tell you why they matter, how to utilize them best, including a little segment that I like to call, Why is my church so weird? I got news for you. Your church is weird. And the smaller your church is, the weirder it is. We're going to talk about why that is and how to lean into it rather than running away from it. Yeah, God gave you the weird for a reason. We're going to talk about that tomorrow morning, okay? Then tomorrow evening, we're going to talk about desizing the church. It's based on my book, Desizing the Church, how church growth became a science, then an obsession, and what's next. I've been doing this ministry for about 14 years now. And at about year 10, we were sitting in the car, my wife and I, leaving a conference like this, and both of us said, well, it feels like we pulled a few more bodies out of the river today. And when we said that phrase, I thought, okay, but I wonder who's throwing them in. Let's go upstream and find out who's tossing the bodies in and creating all of these victims in small churches that are actually good small churches but think they're failing. Let's figure out where we got this idea that bigger is better. So we're going to talk about that tomorrow night as well. Also, just to give you an update as something else that you can participate in if you'd like to, what would you do to get your church healthier in 100 days? That's the basis of my book, 100 Days to a Healthier Church. That book is in an interesting story because it came out in March of 2020. And then about 2 years ago, I started getting all kinds of emails from people who had found it. Like, I don't know if I can call it a second life because it never had a first life. But what I'm doing now is I'm using it as a basis for a 6-week online leadership series that's going to happen from May 5th through June 16th. It's $299 for your entire church. But because you're actually physically here today, I'm going to give you half off of that. So if you scan that and you go to the registration, if you put the words in person, no space, just in person because you're here in person, this is what I give to people who actually show up in person to a conference, you can get it for you and your entire team for $149. So every Tuesday for 6 Tuesdays, and we will also record it so you can watch it later. But it's a great way to talk about how do we become healthier? How do we use small as a strategy rather than fixing problems? All right, and then you can meet me at the book table if you've got any questions on that. This is some of my books. We'll talk about those later. But let me conclude with one last principle and one short story. A big church is not a reward for faithfulness. They're big, so they must be doing something right. Well, probably, but maybe not. Because big and small has got nothing to do with it. A big church is not a reward for faithfulness, which also means a small church is not a penalty for faithlessness. Each has value, and they're worth doing well. So we want to figure out how to do this well. And I want to conclude with a short story about a small church pastor who did well. Several years ago, my wife and I were on the island of Newfoundland off the east coast of Canada. If you don't know where Newfoundland is, that's okay. North America is a giant V, and on top of the V on the west coast is Alaska. On top of the V on the east coast is the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Newfoundland is the island off the coast. Labrador is the northern land above it, parallel to Alaska on the other side. So we were there at a conference. I was talking with the pastor, and I asked him, where do you do ministry? And he said, I'm in Nain, Labrador. And I said, never heard of that. Where is it? He says, it's the northernmost town on the coast of Labrador, which means it's about as remote and about as cold a place as people live. So I said, tell me about ministry in Nain. He said, well, it's been interesting. He said, there's no ways to get in or out of Nain by road. You can only get in or out by plane or by boat. And you can only do that for 5 months of the year because for 7 months of the year, they're iced in, and even planes and boats can't get in or out. So you're stuck for 7 months. I said, wow, okay. So ministry there must be tough. He said, yeah. He said, in fact, we couldn't get a pastor to stay longer than a year. As soon as the thaw hit, they were out and they never went back. I said, so how long have you been there? He said, 14 years. I went, okay, I want to talk to you. I said, tell me about ministry in Nain. He said, well, we got there and we found out not only are you frozen in for 7 months to the town, but every once in a while blizzards will come through and it'll freeze you into your home for days or weeks at a time. People in California don't understand this. Some of you might have a better understanding of this. And he said, after the first big freeze like that, we went back to church, and a couple of our church members were missing the first Sunday, so I went to visit them. And I found 2 of our church members frozen to death in their homes. He said, my wife and I realized our first job is to address this problem. He said, there are 1,400 people in Nain, mostly of the Inuit tribe. And the older Inuits, especially when they move into town, they've had a culture for generations of being nomadic. And in their culture, you don't own more than you can carry. And we cannot convince them. Their culture will not allow them to own more than they need immediately right now in their homes. So he said, my wife and I spent every spare hour we had, and we cut firewood, and before every blizzard, we brought them to every vulnerable church member we knew just to save their lives and keep them alive during the storms. And he said, actually, I said, so what was the hardest part of doing ministry in Nain? Was it the cold? He said, actually, no. He said, the hardest part of ministry in Nain was being accepted by the people. And in fact, he said, before I came to this conference, I just told them I'm retiring. And they were really upset. I said, well, but imagine. He says, no, like more upset than I thought. Like I went to my best friend to ask him what was going on. My best friend is an Inuit man I led to the Lord years ago, and he's now a deacon in the church. And I said, how did we finally get accepted by the Inuit tribe? What did we do to get accepted by them? He said, Pastor, it's simple. You came, you stayed, and you loved us. I've been searching for over 20 years for an answer to the question, how do you define success in ministry without numbers attached to it? And I don't think I'm ever going to get a better definition than one that was given by an Inuit man from Nain, Labrador. You came, you stayed, and you loved us. And then the pastor said, just to finish my story, said, my wife and I haven't cut wood for the last 10 years. Because while we were cutting wood, we were training our church to cut wood. And now it's grown into a ministry for the entire town. And before every single blizzard, our church people go and take firewood to every single vulnerable person in that town. And I will leave Nain after 14 years knowing that no one will ever freeze to death in their house in Nain, Labrador ever again because God called us there. You want to define success in ministry? That's one of the best pictures I know. I wish someone had told me this at my ordination service because I chased numbers for 25 years. And what I should have been doing was chasing faithfulness. So I pray that's what we'll all do from this point on.
Thank you for listening to the Montana Ministry Network podcast. This episode and more can be heard on our iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube channels. And you can find us at www.montanaministry.org.